Maximum effort tonight, 434, Germany. Target.
The first RCAF bomber squadron, 405 Squadron, was formed in April 1941. It carried the first RCAF attack into Germany by striking at the marshalling yards at Schwerte near Dortmund. Just 3 twin-engine bombers dropped a total of 11,000 pounds of high explosives and incendiaries, about 5,000 kilos, puny in comparison to payloads dropped later in the war. By the end of the year, 4 Canadian bomber squadrons were based in England, spread among 3 different bomber groups of RAF Bomber Command. On the night of May the 30th, 1942, Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, Bomber Harris, launched the first 1,000-bomber raid into Germany.
The Nazis entered this war under the rather childish delusion that they were going to bomb everybody else and nobody was going to bomb them.
68 of them were Canadian. The target was Cologne. By late 1942, most squadrons, including the French-Canadian 425 Squadron, had begun converting from the twin-engine Vickers-Wellington to the formidable 4-engined Handley-Page Halifax Mark II. On New Year's Day, 1943, the famous No. 6 RCAF Bomber Group was created as a purely Canadian group.
The formation of 6 Group was the success, eventually, of getting at least partial Canadianization of the RCAF overseas. An enormous proportion of our pilots flew with 4 Group, for instance, flying Halifaxes rather than 6 Group. An enormous proportion of our pilots flew with British squadrons elsewhere. And by the end of the war, we still hadn't solved that Canadianization problem.
The RAF handed over 7 flying stations dotted around the hills and dales of Yorkshire in northern England. By March, it had 9 squadrons flying Halifaxes and Avro Lancasters. Commanded first by Air Vice Marshal G.E. Brooks, and later by the First World War fighter ace Air Vice Marshal C.M. McEwen, 6 Group eventually included 14 squadrons of heavy bombers. 405 Squadron was detached to form part of the Pathfinder Force, but kept its Canadian identity. It was led by one of Canada's renowned wartime flyers, Wing Commander Johnny Fauquier. The group's first missions were against the submarine pens at Lorient in occupied France. There was public pressure for strikes against these heavily reinforced installations, even though the RAF would have preferred to hit the Hamburg shipyards where the U-boats were being built. The bombers went over on 5 nights in January, sometimes flying through the dirtiest weather. Of course, even after some 2,000 bombers had dropped their loads on Lorient and flattened the town itself, the pens remained intact and the U-boats continued to sail to and from them. In March, a massive combined Anglo-American bomber offensive was given the go-ahead at the Casablanca Conference. This allowed the Allied air forces to set aside morale breaking in favor of a wholesale destruction of Germany's war industries. It was designed as a year-long softening up in advance of an invasion of Europe.
Strategic bombing was an inevitable policy in the Second World War. Long-range bombing on targets of great strategic importance were thought to be things that would have a very strong impact on the outcome of operations and on the war. But Bomber Harris had been working between the wars on the use of bombing aircraft in the Middle East in colonial operations, and he was convinced of the value of strategic bombing as a doctrine. Trenchard, between the wars, had been pushing the idea of strategic bombing as the role of the Air Force, as the means of winning a war. This was a war-winning device. So it was almost inevitable that the High Command of the Air Force would push for strategic bombing. And Churchill grabbed onto it as a means of carrying the offensive to the enemy when there was no other means of doing so. Whether strategic bombing was the correct policy is another question altogether.
Bombing did become more accurate, thanks to the Pathfinder's target marking techniques and better radar. In effect, these advances allowed all-weather flying and blind bombing. 6 Group flew missions against the industrial heartland of the Ruhr Valley and against cities such as Essen, Stuttgart, Wilhelmshaven, Hamburg, Mainz, and Berlin, Turin in northern Italy, and Caen in the south of France, to mention but a few.
Peenemünde is on the edge of the map up there, and here on the black board you will see a large sketch.
They struck at the V weapon sites at Peenemünde on the Baltic coast, losing 10 bombers on the way home to night fighters, and raided logistical and communication centers on the eve of D-Day. In July and August, the city of Hamburg was just about obliterated by successive Allied raids. The use of window gave the bombers a big edge against the German defenders. Like today's chaff, window was simply metallized strips of paper that, when dropped from the bombers, cluttered the radar screens of German ground controllers and seemed to fill the air with echoed images. Which ones were the real bombers? On each raid, the heavies dropped their bombs on the still burning fires of the previous night's raid. Columns of smoke rose 4 miles into the air. Allied casualties were light. Destruction of the target was near total. Secret German estimates tried to describe the indescribable.
The overheated air stormed through the streets with immense force, taking along not only sparks, but burning timbers and beams, so spreading the fire farther and farther, developing in a short time into a fire typhoon such as was never before witnessed, against which every human resistance was useless.
But it didn't all go the bombers' way. In the winter of 1943-44, the Battle of Berlin was waged, involving repeated nightly raids against the capital. Distance, bad weather, and increasingly sophisticated defensive tactics resulted in only qualified success. Certainly, the damage done to the city was nothing compared to Hamburg. At the same time, 600 RAF and RCAF bombers were lost. The Germans exacted a measure of revenge for Hamburg on the night of July 28th. On a raid over the docks which were under reconstruction, the Canadian group contributed more than 200 aircraft and lost 22 of them to flak and fighters, their heaviest losses in the whole war.
It was a very grim experience. There is no doubt that you had to adopt a fatalistic view in order to go out night after night. And if you completed your tour of 32 operations, you were a very lucky person or a very skillful pilot or in a crew with a very skillful pilot. I've talked to a number of these pilots, and certainly the skill of the pilot had a great deal to do with the survival rate of that crew. Ground crews are the unsung heroes. One of the things that Johnny Folke used to emphasize when he talked about Canadian airmen's accomplishments in the Second World War, he was, of course, was the great Pathfinder leader, was that the ground crew had been ignored and they should be getting much better recognition than they did. There's a very close relationship between ground crew and air crew, and that relationship was very important to the success of the air crew. You know that the air crew couldn't possibly have operated without a very effective and competent ground crew.
6 Group was the single strongest element in Bomber Command, which itself was the most powerful force in the history of military aviation. In August 1944, a brilliant Canadian pilot, Squadron Leader Ian Bazalgette, DFC, was part of a Pathfinder force for a big daylight raid against the V-1 flying bomb launch site at Trossy-Saint-Maxime. After the master bomber and the deputy took direct hits, Bazalgette assumed command and flew his Lancaster towards the target. His plane was hit repeatedly by the murderous flak that came up. Both starboard engines and part of the fuselage were soon on fire, and several crew members wounded. Bazalgette ignored the flak and pressed home his attack, but the bomber was badly damaged. He gave the order to bail out. 2 of the crew were too badly injured to jump. With the Lank still at 1,000 feet, Bazalgette could have jumped and saved himself, but he chose to stay with the plane and attempt a crash landing. But on his final approach, the village of Senant suddenly appeared directly in his path. Villagers could only watch as the burning Lancaster plunged towards them. At the last possible second, Bazalgette pulled the bomber up and away from their homes and put the plane down in a textbook wheels-up landing in a nearby field. But the aircraft exploded. His remains were taken from the wreckage by the villagers and hidden from the occupying German forces. He was buried later in the village graveyard. His mother received his VC from the king at Buckingham Palace that following December. The biggest RCAF raid of the war took place on the 6th of October, 1944, when German resistance in the air had been much reduced. Nearly 300 bombers raided Dortmund in daylight, with the loss of only 2 aircraft. In fact, 6 groups suffered the smallest percentage of losses of any Allied bomber group in the war, while flying the highest number of sorties. Fierce fighting continued through the Allied breakout at Caen, the closing of the Falaise Gap and the destruction of the German 7th Army, the pursuit through the Scheldt, the battle at Arnhem, and the liberation of Holland, and the perfectly timed but failed German counteroffensive in the Ardennes forest in December. It was during these missions that the bombers resumed their original role of ground support, really a form of aerial artillery. In the month of the invasion, pilot officer Andrew Charles Mynarski earned his Victoria Cross. Again, it was a posthumous award. The air gunner stayed in a burning Lancaster after the rest of the crew had bailed out, trying desperately to save a trapped comrade. Eventually, Mynarski bailed out too, but he left it too late. His flight suit was already ablaze. French civilians watched him descend on fire. He died quite soon after reaching the ground. Almost unbelievably, the trapped rear gunner survived the crash of the Lancaster. It was he who told of Mynarski's bravery. 428 was the first squadron to go home. Bomber Harris saluted them as they took off. 215,000 Canadians served in the RCAF during the war, including more than 17,000 women. 95,000 went overseas to Britain and Europe, Iceland and Ceylon, and all sorts of places in between.